Fabulous. Okay, right. Well, what I will just do, having just taken your direction to Mr. Introduction, I will just quickly jump to some of the principles for development that we undertook the strategy, because they're quite important in terms of setting the scene. So rather than all the sort of the regulatory side of things, I will just jump into just a few reminders of what the strategy will and won't do and the process we undertook for developing it. So the strategy itself is a landscape scale strategy that identifies what action, what priorities are for nature and what action needs to be taken for those, and also identifies where we should be directing that action to. So it is spatially framed, it is mapped, but it will not draw localized, detailed or definitive boundaries. So it will just identify broad areas where the action is likely to provide the greatest gains. And also, as I said, it identifies measures, but these are potential measures that could be taken to support the recovery of nature. So the strategy does not dictate or instruct their implementation, but rather just suggests the sort of actions that are needed. And therefore it won't force landowners or managers to make any changes to the way they use or manage the land or undertake their operations. But because the strategy will be linked to funding and grants, both from government and other bodies, there is the fact that the action will be incentivized by sort of, if you like, rewarding those who deliver against both the measures in the strategy and delivering those measures in the areas identified as important to nature recovery. It does not offer any statutory protection to land or prevent development from happening, but it does have a role in informing future local plans and also informing development management in relation to biodiversity net gain. And I'll come to more detail on that later on in the presentation. So in terms of how we went about developing the strategy, when we were identifying our priorities and our measures and then targeting them to where they'd be, there were a number of things that we constantly came back to make sure that we were delivering a strategy that recognised the already in place functions and areas of importance within the county, to make sure that none of that was undermined or overlooked. So the first principle of the strategy was strategy's development was to consider the landscape character in its development, to consider the catchment functions and also all the ecosystem links that occur within the county. So this was to make sure that any priorities or associated potential measures that were identified for nature recovery did not interrupt or negatively affect the ecological functionality of the county currently. We wanted to make sure that we focused on the most significant impacts arising from pressures and challenges, and also making sure that where we were addressing impacts, that these were impacts that we actually were within our gift to address. So there was a lot of discussion right at the beginning of the strategy about whether water quality was something that the strategy could address, because obviously that's a real important issue and something that's very much present in people's minds currently. And whilst the strategy might not have the ability to address some of the causes of water pollution in the county, there were opportunities for us to help mitigate those impacts, to minimise the impacts, and also to address some of the pressures that exist that cause the poor water quality that we have in the county. We also looked to target our efforts to those areas of most significance and importance, and that's both locally and nationally. So on a national basis, it might be that we hold a particularly large proportion of the UK's resource for that habitat, or it might be locally that we only have a very limited amount of that habitat, and again, therefore, that was very significant at a county level. So we were looking at concentrating on habitats that were threatened in relation to extent, but also habitats that were degraded in quality or were at risk from climate change. And further to this, when we were thinking about our habitats, we also gave detailed consideration to the needs of threatened species that might depend on these. Further, we look to support both the local and national priorities and ambitions that exist within the country and county. And those, again, weren't just for nature, but also looking at how we could maximise some of the other benefits that come from a healthy natural environment. So looking at where we might be able to support the ambitions of green and blue infrastructure. So, for instance, where there may be areas of low green space or low access to green space, that potentially where we were looking to create new habitat that wasn't vulnerable to human disturbance, that perhaps that could be targeted to these areas where there currently was a low proportion of green space to the population, or where there may be particular health issues in that area that could be addressed by better ability to get out and about. We also look to identify actions and delivery mechanisms needed to achieve the priorities and target those to where they were most in need of action and where wider benefits would be delivered. So you'll hear that said quite a lot through this presentation, and that's because there's obviously a huge amount of things that we might like to do, and there also are a huge number of areas where we might like to do that. But one of the purposes of the strategy was to focus that down. So the decision was taken that we would be focusing the actions that were most needed and the areas that would benefit most from that action, but also would look to provide wider benefits from targeting action in that area. And that brings us to our final principle, which is by doing so, we would therefore maximise opportunities for delivering nature-based solutions. And that's not just about sort of recognising the benefits that a natural environment can provide in terms of those ecosystem services, but also the fact that by trying to deliver alongside nature recovery action other enhancements for the environmental services provided, that potentially that might open up other pots of funding or other opportunities for investment that might not otherwise be available if we were just purely focusing on nature recovery. Key to all of this, and one of the sort of really overarching principles of the strategy's development, was participatory development. And this was something that was required by the local nature recovery strategy regulations, but something that we really wanted to make sure we embedded right from the very start and made sure that all of our stakeholders had the opportunity to be involved from the very basis of when we were first deciding what it was that we wanted to see the strategy delivering and what we wanted to see the strategy responding to. And by having this participatory approach, it would make sure that the strategy would be based on the most up-to-date data and evidence, that it would be developed with the input of experts, both locally and nationally, that it would be informed by those with local knowledge and practical experience of delivering the actions on the ground, and so therefore would be the most deliverable and based on practical experience strategy that we could develop. And also just made sure that the process was entirely transparent as to how we were going from A to Z in terms of developing a strategy, and bearing in mind that there are some implications of the strategy in relation to biodiversity net gain in terms of ability to access potentially funding and grants. We needed to make sure that it was a really transparent process, so there was no question over how we had arrived at what we've got to today. And we put a call out to stakeholders, and we were absolutely blown away by the amount of people that got involved in the process, with well over 1,000 people getting involved. And we had people participating from sectors, very wide sectors, and really sort of broad engagement across, with over 285 different organisations, bodies, businesses and affiliations being involved across the project. And we also, that was also added to from the board and delivery group, who effectively acted as sort of the scrutiny panel and steering group respectively. We also had a group that involved just the local planning authorities to ensure that this was going to be something that could work with the local planning system. We had advice from our relevant government agencies, and also the work was overseen by a number of technical advisory groups who assisted and advised in terms of the mapping, the selection of the priority species, approaches for land management and land use, the particularly complex interactions that exist within freshwater and coastal habitats, and also assisting us with our communications work. And we really are very grateful to all of that input. And I know there's a few people on the call today who've been involved at various stages with the project, and we're really grateful for that input. And because we did have that input, when I say we, as in we want this to happen, we want that to, and I'm not talking about KCC, I'm talking about the we being all the stakeholders and what they have determined they'd like to see from this strategy. And on that point as well, it's just to say that this is not a Kent County Council strategy. So KCC were effectively given a grant to deliver this strategy. We're working on behalf of DEFRA, and it's very much a strategy that is developed on behalf of the county for DEFRA and is not a Kent County Council strategy. So I will just quickly, briefly pause here to see if there are any questions just on those sort of background slides. But if they're not, I will skip over. So, Katie, any questions or hands up?
No, we've not got any at the moment.
You answered that too quickly. I didn't even have time for a sip. Right. So let's crack on then to what you will actually find in the strategy. So the strategy itself is divided into 2 documents plus the online mapping tool. Part 1 of the strategy sets the context and essentially provides a justification for the priorities and actions the strategy proposes. So it sets out what we have in the county, what's so special and important about our habitats and species, what challenges and changes we've observed across the years, and those challenges and pressures that we want to be addressing as part of the strategy. A look at that local and national context in terms of other strategies that we're wanting to support and link into, and then also the opportunities that exist for nature recovery, but also nature-based solutions. So that sort of background scene setting document I've decided not to focus on today because my feeling is that most of us probably know what makes this county so special, and you're more likely to be interested in effectively the real nuts and bolts of the strategy as presented in part 2. But if when you do look at part 1 you have any questions or would like to discuss any part of it, please do feel free to get in contact with the project. So as I said, part 2 is essentially the strategy, the new thing that is being brought into the county. And really in this part is where you'll find all the elements of this are the elements that are required under legislation, under the regulations from a local nature recovery strategy. So that is the vision, and with that, the priorities that the county wants to see for nature recovery, the potential measures associated with those, and then those potential measures mapped, a map of the areas of particular importance for biodiversity, a map of the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, and the local habitat map. So all of those are the required elements of the strategy, and I'll now take us through each of those in turn. So the first element was our principles and our visions. So the principle of the local nature recovery strategy will probably look in the main very familiar to you because they are based on the Lawton principles. So what we want to see is, as a result of the strategy, we want to see the quality of our existing habitats improved and making sure that they're in a strong and functioning state. So essentially better looking after better what we already have. We then want to see those existing sites extended, increased, making sure that our most valuable and important habitat sites are buffered and are sort of safeguarded from those impacts by having a wider area to them. Then we want to see more habitats, more nature-rich sites created and established. And that's not only to provide the space for nature, but also to provide connectivity between our existing core sites. And like I say, so they're moving on that, making sure that everything is joined up, enhancing the connections that already exist and creating new ones to make sure that the landscape of the county is much more easily crossed by wildlife and by nature, so that in particular there is the ability for them to respond to, for instance, the impacts of a changing climate or any other impacts that might require species to move. But what we have also done is added to those principles to make sure that we're also delivering nature-based solutions alongside our work. So really maximising the opportunities that are presented from a good, healthy and functioning natural environment, and recognising that we have many challenges within the county that nature can help us with. But also put in the private landowners, land managers and farmers really at the heart of all this, and recognising that integral role that they have to support nature recovery. And across the strategy, you will see that all of our potential measures are designed to deliver against at least one of these principles. So when we started reviewing the outcomes that our stakeholders had told us they wanted to see for nature in the county, there were some clear emerging high-level ambitions that were centred around the broad habitat groupings that we have in the county. So these were designed these were used to design 10 ambitions that together make up our vision for the local nature recovery strategy. And under each of these sits more specific priorities, and many of those priorities drill down to really specific habitat types, so really get into the detail of what it is that we want to see for particular habitats within the county. So the ambitions focus on increasing connectivity, increasing the use of nature-based solutions, using land management and land use to deliver our nature recovery gains, and putting species at the heart of habitat management, restoration, extension and creation. And then moving on to more habitat-focused ambitions, there is an ambition to see our species-rich grassland restored, connected and extended, to safeguard our successional habitats from loss and damage, and to bring woodland trees and hedgerows under active management, and also increase cover and connectivity. We then have an ambition relating to freshwater, which is to see that these habitats are clean, sufficient and healthy, and that the associated catchments are restored and their functions are reinstated. To provide for nature in urban environments, and finally to secure high functioning natural and connected coastal habitats. And you will see from those visions, from those ambitions, that the vision is very wordy, and sometimes those words can not mean a lot to some people. So what we've done is we have commissioned some artwork to illustrate those words so much better than arguably the text can. And I appreciate you probably can't see them too well on the screen now, but the artwork will be coming round with us during our consultation roadshow, and they are also available online. So I would encourage you to have a look at those, because they really do illustrate what it is that the vision and ambitions are trying to achieve. So going back to the words though, so sitting under the 10 ambitions are outlined more detailed priorities, and those essentially set out the outcome we want to see for nature recovery in Kent and Medway. And in addition to priorities for habitats, we also identify priority species that action should also be focused on. So the priorities were developed with stakeholders through a series of workshops, and these took us to focus on the outcomes that tackled the county's most notable pressures and challenges, and supported delivery of local and national ambitions against our most significant, important and at-risk habitats. We have 52 priorities in the strategy, and I'm not going to present them all during today's session, and we'll leave you to read those at your leisure. But these are just some examples of the priorities we have under the ambition of connectivity, nature-based solutions, land management, species-rich grassland and successional habitats, and then woodland, chalk streams, urban and coastal. And we also, as I said, have identified priority species. So this was what work was undertaken following guidance from Natural England on how our priority species should be selected, and very much like the sort of the wider aspirations of the strategy, which was to take all the wants and all the desires for the natural environment, and to sort of drill that down into some focused priorities. The same was the case for our our priority species. So first of all, using Natural England's guidance, we identified that within the county, we had, as classified by their criteria, just over 1,500 rare, threatened and significant species within the county, just demonstrating really how rich our natural resource is. So trying to put this down into the 25 to 50 species that Natural England suggested should be our priority species was an almost impossible task. And consequently, we ended up with 141 priority species for the local nature recovery strategy. And yet, you know, this still seems like quite a low number when you consider the number of species we started from. However, what we did is we selected those species not only on the basis of need and urgency, but also in consideration of whether action for them would also support the recovery of other species that were associated with the same habitat assemblage. So the hope is that by taking action for our priority species, there will be much wider benefits to species that also exist within the same habitat types as them. And what we have is 141 species from across all the taxa that were identified. So we've made sure also that all taxa that we had a representative species in that 1,500, we have at least one from each taxa. And as you can see, some of them we have quite a lot in, for instance, birds. And under each priority species, there are also identified actions that need to be taken to support their recovery. And this work was one of those items of work that was overseen by specialists, by a technical advisory group, and we're really fortunate to have over 30 of the county's species specialists and also colleagues from outside the county with species specialisms helping us. Well, I say helping us, they didn't help us do this. They selected, using their excellent knowledge, they selected which species would be the right ones for the county. So we're really indebted to them, but consequently also have confidence that we have selected the right species to act as priority species within the strategy. However, although we have considered how those sort of those another 1,300 species identified as rare and threatened have identified a way in which we hope they will be addressed, we have also included a sort of a catch-all priority to make sure that they still are within the thoughts of anyone designing any action for nature recovery. So we make sure that within the strategy they are also given some consideration through this priority. So, as I said, there are potential measures for the species, and that's no different for the other priorities. So for each of the priorities that we have in the strategy, and as I said, most of those priorities are related to specific habitats. So under each of those 52 priorities sits a number of potential measures. So these being the proposed action to deliver the priority. And then eventually those potential measures are mapped and targeted to where it will deliver the greatest gains and benefits. So I have on the screen here an example of how you view or how you can view the potential measures within the strategy. So this is an example of the priority that relates to coastal and floodplain grazing marsh. And within the strategy, every priority has its associated potential measures listed, and that also denotes which principles of the strategy they relate to. So in this case, we have a potential measure that relates to better. We have a potential measure that relates to more, and a potential measure that relates to connectivity. Also included in some of the priority tables are a number of things that sit outside the scope of the local nature recovery strategy, but that we wanted to include within the strategy because we felt that otherwise it would be lacking and it would lose some of the context. So one of those items is supporting measures. So they're not shown for this particular priority, but on a number of our priorities, we have identified supporting measures that sit outside the scope of the local nature recovery strategy. So that's because the local nature recovery strategy is required to focus on habitats and species alone and does not focus on some of those more softer processy type actions that might be required. But when we took this out to our stakeholders, the stakeholders told us that some of these measures were really important. So things like providing support, advice and guidance to landowners, to contractors, to raise an awareness, to increase in engagement. You know, some of the measures that we have in the strategy that deliver against that better, more better, bigger, more joined up. Some of those principles will only be achieved, some of those measures will only be achieved if we have those supporting measures in place. So that's why we've included them in there. And likewise, we also have these other measures that sit outside the strategy's scope, which relate to evidence and data needs. So as we were designing our potential measures, and in particular as we were trying to map them, it became clear that there was some evidence and information lacking that would really strengthen either the mapping work or our understanding of what the particular pressure is that's resulting in this degradation or issue for nature. So we've also included those in a strategy as well. But again, these are not something that can be delivered as part of the strategy, but are really important that they're not forgotten within the context, particularly when it comes to the fact that we will need to review this between 3 and 10 years time. And so, you know, it's really important that we understand what evidence needs to be collected between now and the review period, so that we can constantly build and improve the strategy in terms of what it's setting out to do. And then finally, what we also have in the tables for the priorities and potential measures are the priority species that are associated with the habitat that priority and the potential measures are associated with. When you have a look at the document, you will see that in the measures table, the measures may have a reference number. So here, all of our measures have a reference number beginning GL and then following a number. Any measure that has a reference number is a measure that has been mapped, and any measure without is a measure that hasn't been mapped. And also within the document, you will see some measures are bold, like all of these are, and some of the measures are not. And that denotes the bold measures are the measures which the mapping went on to provide the baseline for the opportunity areas, and those that aren't in bold did not. And I'll explain why that was the case shortly. So if you were interested in looking at where that particular measure was mapped, you would just take the reference number, go onto the online tool and select the relevant map based on the reference number. And I'll show you the mapping tool shortly. So with the potential measures, we then had to map and target to where they would deliver the best gains, deliver the widest benefits, and also look for opportunities for nature-based solutions and other wider environmental benefits. We do provide a lot more detail in the strategy and appendices to how the mapping was developed, but in brief, we approached it by first of all looking at what data and evidence was available to inform and define the map of each potential measure. And initially, this was used to determine whether we could map the measure or not, and whether it would be mapped was dependent on whether there was sufficient information to enable the action to be targeted to where it was most needed or where action would be most beneficial. By applying this approach, it meant that not all the measures could be mapped. This might have been just simply because there was no data, but in some cases as well, it was that the appropriate mapping approach was too costly or time consuming. But largely most of it related to not being able to target that potential measure to sites. So that initial approach of only mapping the measures that could be sufficiently refined to inform the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, the opportunity areas, meant that with the initial mapping work, some of the areas of the county appeared from the mapping to have no potential or no importance for nature recovery. And obviously this was not the case, and instead just represented areas where measures largely related to improving management or installing management, and therefore there was little on which to prioritise one area over another. Or it might just be that there wasn't sufficient data to enable the required refinement, and consequently the mapping was just very much broad coverage across the whole county. But when we discussed this with stakeholders, they understandably viewed this as problematic. They felt that it misrepresented the actual value of these areas to nature recovery and made it look like there were some areas that just did not have any potential. So in response to this, we decided to take the approach to, if we could map a potential measure, we would, whether it was something that could be easily defined or refined, or whether it was just mapping it to the extent of the existing habitat or the potential for that habitat type. So consequently, we ended up with a lot more maps, but we had maps of every single potential measure, identifying every opportunity there was within the county to deliver on that particular action. That those maps were then reviewed and refined with stakeholders and partners, and this was really important because it was the mapping was a desk-based approach, and so it allowed us to ground truth the assumptions that had been made with those who really knew the local area and things on the local level. It also enabled us, in some instances, to actually focus and target to more defined areas, and also importantly to consider deliverability. And we looked at also further refining the potential measures by focusing on opportunities to opportunities to address wider environmental challenges through the use of nature-based solutions, and also other benefits such as health and access. So going back to the point I made earlier about where we might choose one area over another to put in place some new habitat because that provided opportunity to also address low access to green space. All of the potential mapping is available online, and I will cover that tool later on. Within the strategy, we only have the grouped measures presented. So you will only see one map per priority. You won't see a map for each potential measure. That's just simply because the potential measures mapping at a county level really isn't that useful. And instead, it's better just to present where the opportunities broadly lie in the county for that particular habitat, and then get people to go online and have a look at the detailed map. So here we have all of the potential measures that are mapped for coastal and floodplain grazing marsh. And then when you go online, you can then actually look at one of the individual measures under that priority. So in this case, it's focusing on restoring grazing marsh, where it offers gains for our critical flora and fauna. And the online presentation not only allows you to really scrutinise it sort of, and move around the county and see whereabouts it is, but it also allows you to go down into a more localised level through the Zoom functions, and I'll demonstrate that later. So that brings us to the three maps that the strategy has to present as part of the regulations. And the first one of those is our areas of particular importance for biodiversity, which maps all of our national conservation sites, our local sites, and also irreplaceable habitats. So these are mapped based on the regulations. So we didn't determine what constituted areas of particular importance. That was determined by the regulations. And our understanding is it's based on areas of the county that are already afforded some level of protection or some degree of management that results from either the designation or local planning. So this covers sort of our SACs, our SSSIs, our SPAs, our RAMSRs, but also our local wildlife sites, our local nature reserves, and also irreplaceable habitats as defined by Biodiversity Net Gain. The second map is the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity. So these essentially are the opportunity and target areas that we have mapped, that we have identified. So we had a more autonomy to determine how that would be devised. So the foundation of this map were the map potential measures. Now, as we sort of alluded to, we ended up mapping all of our potential measures, but what that did mean was that nearly every area of the county was covered. So we then had to sort of select the which of the potential measures maps would actually really be used as the foundation. So measures that were insufficiently refined, whether because they sort of related those more broadly, more widely applicable measures, or because of the limitations that we had in mapping, they were excluded. And largely this related to measures that were not focused on restoration, creation or connection. And our understanding is that a lot of the funding that is likely to be made available will relate to these restoration, creation and connectivity actions. So it's not envisaged that the exclusion of this management side of things will reduce the ability to achieve funding for any action being taken in a county. These maps were then refined further by placing more consideration and thought as to where our environmental challenges were, and where it might be really critical to put in place a certain habitat, because that habitat would really deliver a nature-based solution to that particular challenge. So that was looking at things such as where there might be air quality issues, where there might be particularly high flood risk, and things like that we're able to map, that we could then pick. We could sort of select the most likely and most opportunistic areas for delivery of that particular action. That still presented a pretty wide coverage across the county. So finally, we then refined it further to by focusing on connectivity. So we undertook some connectivity modelling, and that allowed us to place priority on areas that had low species flow, that had bottlenecks in terms of connectivity, but also that provided buffering and linking of our existing areas of particular importance. And the rationale for this is that if you think of our principles, particularly the Lawton principles, as a hierarchy, that through putting in place better management, that by making those areas bigger, by bringing in more, you eventually get to connectivity. So that's the ultimate ambition in our mind of the strategy, that through putting in place all those measures, that we will have a better connected landscape, and we will go from better to joined up. So that was the rationale for why the final refinement focused on connectivity. Now, this just is a way of demonstrating why we needed to refine. So, as I said, not all of our potential measures could be used to inform the map because their coverage was too wide and too undefined. And this map really illustrates the point quite well by featuring all of the mapped potential measures. And as you can see, there's coverage across the whole county. And this isn't surprising. We already know that everywhere has the potential to be an important area for nature. But the requirements of the strategy development was that we needed to be more focused. We did need to pinpoint areas. So that was why we went through that refinement process. And what we result with is a map that looks like this. So this is our areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity map, with a coverage of 38% across the county. And finally, the final mapping requirement of the strategy was to produce the local habitat map. And this is essentially made up of our areas that are areas of particular importance and our areas that could become of importance, and combining them together. And essentially what the local habitat map presents are areas of strategic significance. And so you can see on that map there. I will outline how the strategy and its maps are used to inform nature recovery in the final session, but I'll just pause now in case there are any questions about the strategy's ambitions, priorities, measures, and the approach we took to mapping. So I'll hand over to you, Katie.
I haven't got anything in the Slido.
Okay.
Unless anyone's got anything they want to raise their hand for.
Okay, so in terms of the programme for the briefing this morning, we had put in place a short break in case people needed it. If people would like a break, perhaps just raise your hand. Otherwise, if there's no hands raised, we'll plough on.
No hands, Liz.
Lovely, excellent. Right, I will crack on then. So the final part is looking at how the strategy will be used to inform nature recovery, and how you can use the online mapping tool in elements of that. First of all, just to point out, so there are quite a lot of elements in relation to how the strategy will do this and how the strategy will do that we don't yet know. So as I said beforehand, the strategy is essentially a DEFRA strategy. It is a strategy that, combined with all the other strategies, will set out a nature recovery network for the whole of England. And therefore, the strategy's role in how it informs planning, how it informs biodiversity net gain, how it informs funding, investment and grants is all to be determined by DEFRA. And there to date has been very limited detail. So we have an idea of how it's going to work, but the actual mechanisms by which that will all work, we have limited detail on. So what I'm going to present now is very much how we see the strategy informing local nature recovery strategy based on what we know to date, and how we understand it, and how we have read and interpreted the regulations. I should say that we have sort of check this thinking with Natural England, so it's not just sort of posturing and speculating. It can be taken fairly confidently, although of course with things like planning reform very much in process at the moment, we're not entirely sure how planning reform, and also for that matter devolution, will affect things, and that's something that we currently don't have any information on, but we will be seeking from DEFRA, because understandably it's a question that has been coming up at pretty much every one of these briefings that we've held. So we've produced this online mapping tool to host the maps. It's been the tool you'll see as part of during the consultation is a tool that's been created for the purposes of the consultation. So it's, well, I keep saying it's a simple tool. I'm pretty sure that Kent Wildlife Trust will absolutely refute that. They produced the maps. They've done a fabulous job at producing all the maps and also producing this online tool. So it's, when I say simple, I mean that it has limited functionality and limited ability to sort of play around with the maps for the time being, just because, as I said, we're still not entirely clear the mechanisms by which the local nature recovery strategy, and importantly the maps, will be used to inform the various elements of the strategy's implementation. So we didn't want to design an all singing, all dancing and spend our limited resources on a tool that then in 6 months' time, when we come to publish the strategy, we find is just not fit for purpose. So in terms of the online tool, we are inviting feedback on the maps, but not on the actual tool itself. We'll be developing something over the course of the next 6 months. But of course, we will be going out to people who we envisage using the tool to find out what it is that you'd like to see on the tool, so we can try and make it as user-friendly as both technology and budget allows us to. So when you first launch the mapping tool, you will get the pop-up shown, and it's very simple. You just read through, just check all the details. It gives you a few instructions, and then you click the OK arrow. The note about the layers taking a while to load is important to note. There is a huge amount of data sitting behind this mapping tool, and so depending on internet speeds and your computer, it can take potentially up to 2 minutes. So please be patient. Personally, I've not found it take more than sort of 10 seconds or so to load, but obviously it really depends on your systems. But if it does stretch over 2 minutes, it may be worth just refreshing the page. And if you find you have ongoing issues with loading the maps, please do let us know. To date, it all seems to be working fine. But because of the risk of things stalling, I'm not going to do a live demonstration of the tool today. I'm just going to use some screenshots. So once you've clicked OK, you will be given the map interface, which is shown here. And the different map options can be selected from the layers menu just here. When you open that, it gives you the opportunity to select some of the mapping functions. So first of all, you can choose your preferred baseline map. So we have street map, grayscale or satellite imagery, and street map is the default view. You can also select to include the district boundaries and also district layers, and also whether you want rivers featured or not. And again, the default for all of those is to be on, and you just click them, any ones you don't want on. you can find full details of all of the potential measures by clicking on the mapping table button to the left-hand side of the screen, and I will show you how that works shortly. And there also is a zoom function where you use the plus and minus buttons to zoom in and out. So if you click on that little table icon, you will be presented with a table like this. And effectively, if you want to know, if you sort of looked at the numbers down the side of the mapping layers and you want to know what those particular numbers relate to, you pop it in the box here to the very left of the screen, and that will tell you what the particular reference number relates to. It will tell you the detail of the measure, whether that was included as one of the foundation layers for the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, and the method by which it was mapped. And more detail on the method for mapping and the specific data used is provided in the strategy appendices, but that's just to give you a quick overview of how that map was created. We had to do it this way because some of the measures, as you can see just from the examples given there, are very wordy and long, and to include all of them in the tool online would just make it quite difficult. What our hope is that we will look to create a tool that rather than selecting the measure, well, there will be the option to select the measure, but also there'll be the opportunity to just look at a parcel of land and see which of the measures have been identified there. So we will look to do that in the future. So looking at how you might use the maps and what purposes the strategy might be used for in terms of nature recovery. So the strategy proposes the action that's required for nature recovery in Kent and Medway, and the mapping work indicates where all of these potential measures could be delivered. And in some instances, as I've said, these are quite wide ranging where we've not been able to focus them. In others, they're on very specific areas because we've been able to really define and find a way by to identify where those areas would be deliver the best. In all cases, however, mapped areas are indicative. Some management measures are there to increase the functionality or biodiversity of a habitat. Those are mapped, some are not. Mapping indicates where that management may be most needed or result in the greatest gains, but it needs to be remembered that the introduction of appropriate management, and that being right management in the right place at the right time, that any introduction of appropriate management will deliver benefits wherever it is applied. It is just the mapping indicates where in the county that might be best targeted. And the strategic nature of the document, the way in which we've been required to map this based on a county strategic level means that some measures might not have been identified as relevant or appropriate when considered at the sort of the county scale. But the exclusion from the mapping does not indicate that that action is not applicable at the local level. It just doesn't have the same value or doesn't deliver the same strategic benefits that another site does. Further, because it was a desk-based approach, it means that the mapping is theoretical and not based on actual known site conditions. So site assessments and other permissions and prerequisites are required and will be required to further inform the appropriateness of this action. So not only does a mapped measure not preclude the need for all of the usual permissions and prerequisites that might be required for that sort of action, you will still need to do that. You still also will need to assess that site for that potential measure, and that's particularly important because some sites have more than one measure identified for them, and so it's really important to determine which of those measures is the most appropriate based on the local site conditions. And obviously, as you can well appreciate, that's not something that a strategy of this nature, of this scale, is able to do, so that there is that requirement to consider local needs. Also, importantly, the strategy does not, and its maps do not dictate actions nor instruct their implementation. The maps and the measures suggested are there as a guide for how anyone who might own the land or manage the land, how they might approach their operations or their use or management of the land in a way that could support the recovery of nature. But there's no requirement on them to actually do that. So if you were wanting to have a look at where a particular potential measure has been mapped for a particular habitat type, there's a number of ways you can do this. So first of all, you may already know from having sort of scanned through the strategy document, you may already know the particular measure or priority reference that you're interested in. So in that case, you would just simply put your potential measure, select your potential measure from the measures layer, the mapping layer, check that, and that will bring up the map for you. But it may also be that you're just looking for a priority or measure that relates to a specific habitat type. So you have some land, you know that it's a particular habitat type, and you want to see what measures have been identified for that habitat, and B, where those potential measures have been identified for delivery, to see whether your land happens to be in that. So if that's what you're looking to do, first of all, you would just type in the habitat type into the measures box. So you can also do that if there's a particular action you're interested in as well. So you could either put in the measures box the habitat you're interested in or the type of action you're interested in. When you type in the habitat, that will bring up all the potential measures that relate to that habitat type. So in this case, we have 3 different potential measures that relate to grazing marsh. So you would either note all of those numbers down or just note the number down of the particular measure you're interested in. So those are the 3 that have been identified. And then you go back to the map viewer. So going on the basis, we're going to have a look at the potential measure GL 2.2, which is something that we've looked at a couple of times in this presentation. You simply select the number in the mapping tool, and everything that comes up blue is indicates where opportunities for delivery of that potential measure have been identified to exist. So you can see that that particular potential measure has been identified in various locations around the county. And by using the zoom in and out buttons at the top, you can really sort of zoom down to see exactly where in the county that measure has been identified as an opportunity. A second purpose of the strategy is to denote the areas of strategic significance. So the areas of strategic significance are effectively the local habitat map. Where a potential measure falls within areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, this indicates potential measures that may be considered strategically significant. So if land falls into that area and the action aligns with the potential measures identified, this may be classed as strategically significant for any grant funding and or investment scheme that's using the local nature recovery strategy strategic significance as an indicator. This is an area where we've just been told that the local nature recovery strategy will be used to incentivise both government grants, but other sort of charitable and private funding pots and investment pots. And this is how we envisage that particular sort of incentivisation would work. But the real detail of that is currently largely unknown. Where we've got a bit more understanding, but limited sort of practical application of, is the use of strategic significance in biodiversity net gain calculations. So for those of you not aware, biodiversity net gain is a mandatory requirement that aims to make sure that development has a measurably positive impact on biodiversity. And that gain is calculated through the use of a standard metric, and that identifies the biodiversity value of the land lost and the value of the biodiversity to be gained, and looks to make sure that that balances with a 10% favour. The metric that is used to calculate all those values includes a strategic significance multiplier. And in the case of biodiversity net gain, that multiplier is related to the local habitat map and the potential measures that fall within it. So biodiversity net gain is a process which would appear to provide opportunities and provide a positive impact for nature. But that gain will be much more meaningful than just essentially a tick box exercise in terms of nature recovery if the gains are not only situated to where we need gains made, but also deliver action that we've identified needs to be delivered. So therefore, the high strategic significance will be applied when the habitat parcel is located in an area proposed to deliver the nature recovery strategy priorities, and the intervention that is proposed for that biodiversity net gain is consistent with the potential measures proposed also for that location. The areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, it's really important to understand they do not indicate areas where development should be excluded, and they do not dictate action or place any limitations on how the land should be used either. And in the absence of the awaited guidance on how the local nature recovery strategy will inform local planning, it's not expected that existing plans and policies are revised in reference to the strategy. Although our understanding is that they will need to take account, and in time, as local plans are revised and updated with the local nature recovery strategy actually in place, so in Kent that will be anything revised and updated post summer 25. It's hoped that the local habitat map and its strategic significance will actually then be embedded, and in actual fact the local nature recovery strategy is a statutory source of spatial information, and so it will be used to inform land use planning and ensure that nature and opportunities for its recovery are properly considered within the local planning revision. Of course, how this actually pans out in respect of devolution in the county, assuming we are going that way, we don't yet know, but arguably it could mean that actually the local nature recovery strategy could be embedded quicker than may be the case if the local plans all need to be revised and updated as a result of devolution. So the online map also helps you identify the areas of strategic significance. So the way in which you bring up the map of strategic significance is you select both layers of areas that could become of importance and areas of existing importance for biodiversity. And the areas that could become of importance is shown in yellow, and the areas of importance are shown in green. And collectively, these make the areas of strategic significance. So anything that is either yellow or green can be considered an area of strategic significance. The way you would use this to identify if a potential measure is within an area of strategic significance is, first of all, you will select, excuse me, the measure that you want to view. So we were going back to our grazing marsh restoration. And then you click both the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity and areas of particular importance for biodiversity. And that creates the map that looks as such. So I've done this scanned in at quite a detailed level to be able to pick up where the different areas are defined. Basically, what you will see when you pull that up is any area that's in dark green or orange, as indicated on the map here. These are where the potential measure does fall into an area of strategic significance, and therefore would be valid for the strategic significance multiplier in the metric. But also depending on how funding proceeds and investment and grants from government proceeds, could also indicate that any action within that area, any action for that measure against that measure in that area would also be looked favourably in terms of funding and investment. If when you click it on, your area of land remains blue, this means that the potential measure has been mapped to your area of land, but it does not fall into an area of strategic significance. So again, that's not to say that that potential measure shouldn't be delivered there. That is absolutely not the case, but it just would not be eligible for any relevant uplifts or incentivisation that come through being in the position of being within an area of strategic significance. You'll see on the map as well, there are areas that remain a light green and a yellow. These are the areas of strategic significance where that potential measure does not fall. You can view if a potential measure sits just within the area that could become of importance for biodiversity or areas that are of importance for biodiversity. So you could just click one or other of those two layers, and then you can view whether it just falls into that particular definition. we don't yet know whether that would be a useful way of viewing it, but potentially it might be, for instance, that certain funding mechanisms do not permit delivery of an action in an area already considered under management or designation. So in that case, you would want to look at the ASIB, because that excludes those areas that are considered already under protection. So that's how the mapping can be used. And there's a few more opportunities whereby the local nature recovery will influence and the role it will have. So once the strategy is published, as I said, hopefully that will be by summer this year. The strategies area planning authorities will be required by law to take account of the strategy in preparation of any local plan, any minerals and waste plan, or any neighbourhood plans. And this is a really important role for the strategy, making sure that nature and the opportunities for its recovery is considered alongside all other plan making and all other demands and uses of the land. Within the county, many of the county's planning authorities already have in place revised local plans and policies, or their revision process is well advanced. And in the absence of that guidance, we are not expecting that the strategy will be applied retrospectively or supersede any land use decisions already taken, including allocated sites. The strategy also is not designed as a tool to prevent development, and the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity does not preclude development. But the role of it instead is to inform local plans, and through its role in biodiversity net gain, guide development to maximise positive outcomes for nature. I talked about previously that some of the areas actually have more than one action identified for them. And the reason we've included all opportunities as opposed to just selecting one potential measure is it means that no opportunity for nature recovery is missed. And also where an individual may be looking at a large, broad area of land, that a range of habitats are considered across that land to create that mosaic of habitats that we know nature recovery needs. Between now and the summer, we will be undertaking some further work to help people and to give a steer as to which priority should be the one first tackled. But largely these we envisage will be based on the application of the strategy's principles and that hierarchy. So first of all, the first action would be to take any action that improves, that makes it better, that ensures that management is in place to begin with. Then we'll look to build on that habitat by extending it and by buffering it. But where there's not the opportunity to extend or establish new, then you would look to create new and additional habitat. And finally, we envisage that by tackling better, bigger and more in our areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, that final principle of connectivity will be delivered. So there's not necessarily the need to focus on connectivity first, because the very nature of the fact is that all of our better, bigger, more actions have been designed and have been focused to be delivered where that connectivity is needed. We also need to think about how we can steer people towards giving priority to measures that also offer opportunities to deliver against our priority species. So one final note in relation to what the strategy might do, or rather what it won't, is in relation to protecting nature. I think there has been quite a lot of discussion over the role of the local nature recovery strategy in protecting nature. The strategy provides a framework for nature recovery, directing action to where it's most needed and where it will deliver the greatest gains, and does not, unfortunately, offer any formal or otherwise protection, which can only be provided through statutory designations or the local planning policy. It does not have any statutory function in this regard. Of course, it does have a role in informing local planning, so local authorities may use the strategy in the future to help identify land that could be set aside for the purposes of nature recovery, and we would certainly encourage them to do that, but there is no requirement on a planning authority to do that, in fact. And so therefore, no element of the mapping should at this stage be viewed as any level of protection or any level of prevention in terms of preventing anything from happening in that area. One area where this may help or may lead to some form of either management or protection, or focus on the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, is that the government does have this 30 by 30 target, whereby they aim for 30% of the land to be under protection or management by 2030. And our understanding is that the local nature recovery strategy, and in particular the areas of strategic significance, will be looked at, or the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity will be looked at as potential areas that could be used to help deliver against that target. But until that is confirmed, it really should, the mapping should not be viewed as any sort of protection or prevention. So before I finish up, I'd like to use this quote from Sir David Attenborough to remind us of why such a strategy, and importantly the ownership and delivery of it together, is necessary. We really do need to work together on that, and that is why it's really important we hear everyone's views on the strategy, so that we can ensure it is something that you not only endorse and support, but also can adopt in the delivery of any action you might be taking for nature recovery. So that's the end of the presentation. I'll now hand back to Katie to see if there are any further questions.
So we had one on the chat asking where to find the mapping tool on the website. So I've put a link in the chat there to Let's Talk Kent, which is where the consultation is being held. And if you scroll just past the introduction video, you've got the 3 squares, part 1, part 2, and then the mapping is in the furthest one on the right.
Lovely, thank you, Katie. Yes, so all of our consultation, all of the draft documents that relate to the strategy and consultation are all available from Let's Talk Kent. So you need to go there for the consultation documents and mapping, as Katie says.
We've also got a hand up from Katia.
Katia, do you want to come in?
Yes, hi, yeah, thanks for that. That's really useful. So that mapping, that was me. I couldn't find it, but I was looking on the different sites on the local nature making space for nature. That's why I had a look on the map, and it's started a useful tool, but at the moment I think it's quite clunky and it's quite difficult to find your way around it, but I'm sure it'd be a bit better in a few months' time. So thank you very much for that. As a consultant ecologist, I think that's going to be really useful. We do a lot of work with BNG, so that's a big thing there. This is all really useful information. Like you said, quite worried about what's happening. And my main concern will be with regards to rolling out for district level licenses for all sorts of stuff when no one wants to put forward their land for habitat creation, etc. So we'll see how that pans out. But yeah, just a big thank you to everyone involved in that project so far. It's going to help a lot of things in Kent, so I just wanted to say thank you.
Fabulous, thank you, Katia. That's really useful feedback. What I will say is, so in terms of the questionnaire for the consultation, there are quite a lot of questions in there, but please don't let that deter you from taking part, because you can skip past questions that you don't wish to answer. But we really would love to hear from those who will be using the strategy to help inform their consultancy work, so particularly for biodiversity net gain. And there are questions in there about how easy is it for you to understand how to use this, and how it would be informed, etc. So we'd really welcome feedback on there, because the more user friendly and the more able we are to make the document sort of applicable in every single opportunity that there is, the more likely it is that this will then turn from words into actual action. So hopefully you'll be able to find the time to give us your thoughts back on that. Any other questions, Katie?
We've got a bit of typing. Just say we'll be definitely using this, and we've committed to this in our BAP.
Brilliant.
That's all in there. Nothing
Lovely.
on the slide.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming then. Of course, if you if you leave us and you have a chance to look at the document or the slides and you suddenly have another question or anything that you want to query, by all means get in contact with the team. We do have a list of frequently asked questions on the project website, and we're updating that after every online briefing that we hold. So if you do have a question, first check on the website, but if you can't find the answer you're looking for there, then just drop us a line and we'll get back to you. So thank you very much for coming along today. Please do feel free to share the slides and the recording when we circulate it with any colleagues that you think might be interested or any partners. And we look forward to hearing from you. Kerry, thank you for your message. I've just seen that pop up on the screen. It's been fabulous having you involved, and it really has been a really enjoyable process working with so many different people over the course of this project and meeting new faces that we haven't previously worked with. So I will leave you all now to go and enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you very much.